Okay, let's make a start. So welcome to everybody here. Thank you for coming along to this seminar. It's been presented by the Melbourne Social Equity Institute and the Peter McMullen Centre on Statelessness. And today's webinar is titled Perpetual Strangerhood, Experiences of Highly Skilled African Australian Professionals in the Workplace. So I'll just begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which all of us are situated today. For me, that's the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and I'm sure that all of you would probably take a moment to acknowledge the lands that you're situated on as well. And I'd like to just make the point that these are lands that were never ceded. So just a couple of housekeeping things. I can see people are already using the chat to say hi and get acquainted, and that's fantastic. But for any questions that you'd like us to address at the end of the talk, please do use the Q&A function, not the chat function. So yeah, happily keep chatting in the chat, but questions in the Q&A, please. Just also to let you know that this session is being recorded and it will be made available on the Melbourne Social Equity Institute and the Peter McMullen Centre on Statelessness websites next week. Okay, so it's my very great pleasure to introduce Kathomi, but before I do that, I should probably introduce myself as well. I'm Karen Block. I'm here representing the Melbourne Social Equity Institute today, and where I'm one of the coordinators of the research stream on migration and social cohesion. And I'm also a researcher in the School of Population and Global Health at the University of Melbourne. So today our webinar is being presented by Dr. Kathomi Gatwiri, who's a senior social work lecturer in the Faculty of Health at Southern Cross University and a practicing psychotherapist. Her award-winning interdisciplinary research investigates the topics of racial trauma, belonging, blackness and Africanness in Australia. Dr. Gatwiri is a regular writer and commentator for SBS, ABC and The Conversation. She's also the founder and director of Healing Together, a service that provides accessible, culturally safe therapeutic support for people who have been impacted by racial trauma. And given that you're doing all of that, Kathomi, we are so grateful that you made time to come along and speak to us today, and I'll pass over to you now.
Thank you so much, Claire, for that lovely introduction. And thank you so much to everybody who's taken the time to come and spend an hour with us today. So good afternoon, and thank you for taking time outside of your very busy schedules to spend an hour with me and my research today. But first, just like Karen, I would like to acknowledge the land where I'm zooming in from today. I join you from Mianjin, otherwise known as Brisbane, the traditional homelands of the Turrbal people. I would like you to please take a moment to ask yourself whose traditional lands you're on or joining us from today, as we pay our respects to the ancestors and the traditional owners upon which we all gather today. So I would like to acknowledge that I work and live on land that was stolen and land that was never ceded. And here making a personal commitment as a settler on this land that I would do my best not to perpetuate further injustice on this land that supports me at the expense of its original owners. So I'm going to share my screen because I've got some interesting conversations that I would like us to engage in. So give me a moment while I do that. So I hope you can all see my screen. And today I'm going to be talking about Black people. Primarily, I'm going to be talking about Black African people and their experiences of being in the Australian workplace. So the conversation is centered around a program of research that I started in 2018, which was about investigating the Afro-diasporic experiences of very highly skilled African professionals in Australia. And the research has now been published in top journals which you can access through your organizations or through your university library subscription. So you will also be getting a recording of this conversation today if you want to share it with your colleagues, your friends, and your family. Okay, so what's the context of what we are talking about today? So, excuse me while I turn my phone off, sorry. Thanks for that. So what's the context of what we are going to be talking about today? We are going to be looking at a bit of the history, which really is the blueprint of the conversation that we are going to be talking about today. What's the history of Black people in the workplace? What is the relationship between Australia and race? Because all that is going to really influence the experiences that we're going to be hearing about today. So what I found in my research and really available in literature is that most highly skilled immigrants from Africa either arrive in Australia as international students, like myself. I arrived here as an international student in what feels like a lifetime ago, or through skilled visa pathway. So this is the pathway, the migratory pathway, where Australia has a shortage of certain skills and they try to recruit internationally. So we know that Australia as a country has an incredible shortfall in skilled labor. We're talking social workers, doctors, engineers, academics, and many other professions. And Africans actually represent some of the most highly skilled immigrants in this country, and not just in Australia, in many other Western contexts. In the US, that is true as well. Yet the skills and expertise of Africans, and for most Black people, continue to remain undervalued and underused. And we'll have a look at why that is the case today. So the Australian Human Rights Commission indicates that immigrants from sub-Saharan Africa particularly experience some of the highest levels of unemployment compared to other migrant groups. So the most common cited barriers of employment as identified by the department, by the Australian Human Rights Commission, include things like English proficiency and a lack of Australian experiences or references. So if you can see on your screen, you can see that I am a bit critical of the idea that English proficiency is often used to lock people out of work. And I'm going to talk about that later when I give you some of the snapshots of what people told me about their stories. So I'd like to say something about non-recognition of prior work experience. And this goes on for doctors, engineers, nurses, accountants, teachers. What I found is that work experience is often recognized when it's quote unquote non-African. For example, my participants who are trained in the US or Europe often have their skills seen as an asset to the team or to an organization, whereas people who've got quote unquote African expertise are seen as a liability. So there's something to say there about how we can use that lack of Australian experience or expertise as a way to lock people out of employment. So, there's an incredible researcher, Majavu, who has argued that, there are a lot of good, high-paying jobs that are available in Australia, but they are often mostly accessible via white social networks. of which most African migrants are actually not a part of. He adds that Australian institutions can use variables such as English proficiency and lack of local experience to rationalize lower pay, to rationalize refusal of a job refusal, or forcing very highly skilled African migrants to spend thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars to go and do the same thing again in school because there's no recognition, particularly of expertise that is considered African. And for other people, this, structure or system then forces a lot of African migrants to go and do what Majavu calls the dirtiest, hardest jobs just for survival. And these are mostly very, very highly experienced people. So in this way, we can see how covert institutional racism can be disguised through legitimate reasons, to pass Africans over for job opportunities for which they're highly qualified. And what that does is that it creates what we call a downward occupational mobility. So I had people in my research tell me, I haven't even reached the level in my career here than I was when I was in South Africa or in Zimbabwe or in Kenya or Ethiopia, because there's been a downward occupational mobility in terms of expertise. Okay, so why is this the case? And I want to spend a minute here just talking about why race is important. So what did Africans tell me about their experiences at work, and why is the Australian workplace, which is commonly described as race-free, seen as a racial battleground for so many Africans? So how does race and Africanness kind of work together and intersect in the professional lives of African migrants, to really produce these experiences? So before we can even go there, I would like us to recognize that Australia is extremely organized through race. Despite our attempts to want to hide that or deny that or be hostile about it or be reactive about it, we are a country that is very organized through racial hierarchy. And the construction of whiteness and blackness were really very present right at the beginning of colonial Australia. So race has historically been deployed to determine one Australian immigration policy. You remember the White Australian policy, and racial differences in Australia have always influenced the migrant experience. I don't know whether you've heard the joke that, everybody had, a tough time when they came here, and every migrant group has had their fair share of suffering during the immigration wave. So it's almost like this pride that we take in, kind of racializing people and the suffering that occurs during that experience. So before I come to share with you some of the stories that, my participants told me, I would like you to consider for a moment, then if this is the history that we are talking about, then what does it mean to live in a Black body in a white context? And not just in a white context that is extremely organized through race and racialized through its policies, its law, its structures, you name it. So what happens is that a lot of research now points to the concept of racial fatigue, racial fatigue and racial battle fatigue, which are, the experiences that Black people often report of this, often described as constant exhaustion of having to navigate the white gaze, and having to navigate this negotiation of feeling like they need to battle the stereotypes that are imposed upon the Black African body constantly. So you need to prove you're not a criminal, you need to prove that you're not this, you need to prove that you're not that. And there's a gaze with which you're met with every single day that, you know, puts you in a place where you have to defend your racial dignity or your cultural dignity in whichever ways. And this causes a lot of exhaustion. Okay, so what did I find in this research where I interviewed Africans, you know, in the workplace? And these were people who are highly qualified, working either in very high-end jobs or, you know, middle-level management. So the most consistent theme that was raised by almost all my participants was the issue of microaggressions, racial microaggressions. So this was kind of like an unexpected finding for me, but because everybody talked about it, I went to read about it and kind of theorize it a little bit. So racial microaggressions in the workplace generally take very subtle forms of what we think of as everyday or casual racism. And in the workplace, they function to inferiorize Blackness through the normalization of white expertise. So I'm going to share with you 4 key themes that came out of all this big concept of racial microaggressions in the workplace. So take, for example, John, who talked to me about, you know, the idea that, you know, the often accepted narrative of race-free workplaces where everybody, you know, is open to cultural diversity and everybody works respectfully is just not supported by African immigrants working in these organizations. You know, not all the time, but to a large extent. So what is a microaggression? A microaggression is a brief, you know, intentional or unintentional, you know, pattern of indignity that communicates, you know, racial slights, put downs, disrespect, scrutiny. It's almost like a reminder that this is not your space to occupy, but it's never done in a way that shows malice. It's almost done through humor, through comments that are meant to be funny. But they're not funny to people who are on the receiving end. So this is what John said to me about the subtleness of this experience. And what he said to me was that because they are so subtle, it makes it really difficult to name the problem. Because say, for example, if you go to your boss and say, I experienced this, and they go, well, what did they do? And you say, someone touched my hair, you know, or someone keeps asking me where I'm from, or, you know, independently, they don't seem that bad. But we are talking about daily verbal behavioral indignities that create that exhaustion that we talked about. And here John was just talking about even the difference he notices between when his white colleagues are sharing ideas in a meeting versus when he goes to share an idea and people just, you know, there's just this silence as if nothing is being communicated. And he says, nobody notices it, but I do. Okay. Vera, on the other hand, talked about microaggression not being so subtle, but being, you know, not being subtle in that you have to read between the line, but subtle in the idea that there are subtle acts of exclusion, you know. And she was talking about a colleague who'd left the organization, but, you know, kept in touch with everybody else except her, even though they seemed like they were in good terms. But when, you know, like she said, we had somebody who was in our team who then left, went on to another organization. She was having a baby shower and there was a card that was going around being signed for people to go to a baby shower. And I was I was not included in it. No one actively did anything mean, but it's that constant reminder that really you're not part of the in group. Okay, so what the ambiguous nature of microaggressions at the workplace is what we call the burden of interpretation. It's up to you now as the person receiving it to try and decode these ambiguous messages, like, was it intentional? Was it unintentional? What was that? Am I overthinking it? And this creates part of that ratio fatigue that we were talking about before. Now, I want to move on to the second thing, which was micro invalidations. And micro invalidations, as my participants told me, were the minimizations of the very real experiences of racism. So this is performed through the gaslighting Black people or people of color when they share their experiences of racism, or when they go to their boss and said, we were sitting at lunch, someone said something, I felt really uncomfortable. And the boss saying, look, I'm sure they didn't mean it. I'm sure you're just reading too much into it. Don't be too sensitive about it. In Australia, we are really easygoing about this stuff, So, and the micro invalidations also come through when people are overlooked for jobs. So your expertise is invalidated. So Julia, for example, told me about, say, for example, in her workplace, when people go on maternity leave or go on annual leave, even though she's been performing at a very high level in some of these roles, the organization would rather go outside the organization to recruit a white manager rather than promote her to that position. So she told me it's people of color in the organization can only be promoted up to a certain level, and you can feel it. So it becomes really challenging then to do your best when you know there's no reward. So this gatekeeping of opportunities for Black Africans then denies them what we call the middle class ascendancy, because then it fits into that neat stereotype of them being poor, desperate, non-professionals. It kind of feeds into that stereotype. And here I wanted to talk about the micro-invalidations that are invited through speech. A lot of people told me about their accent being scrutinized. So like Banji, who is a senior academic in a university, said that there are times when you might be speaking in a meeting, but because your accent is African, you can just tell as soon as you start speaking that people lose interest. And accent discrimination is actually a well-documented phenomenon. And I want to emphasize that accents are not created equal. They're not ranked equally. African accents are often seen as unintelligent, where European accents, for example, can be seen as worldly, and so through this process, white ways of speaking and of speech are elevated and indexed as the standard and preferable ways of expression. I've had people say to me, I wasn't hired because I have an accent, and they told me as a receptionist, I needed to have an Australian accent, and they didn't like the way that I spoke. Okay, the third one, and then I'm going to come to my final one, is what we call racial suspicions. So the way racial suspicions were enacted for most of my participants is the attitudes that Africans in the workplace are constantly questioned and scrutinized as if they're not supposed to be there in the first place. One of my participants, Paul, said he works as a very specialized nurse. And he said when he's looking at people in the ICU and their families come, the first question they ask him is, where did you do your training? And he's learned that that question doesn't mean that people are actually interested in where he did his training. They want to know, am I actually safe here? with you looking after me? Whereas that question is never extended to any of the white colleagues. And he said to me something interesting. He said, trust me, the moment you say, you know, and this person was trained overseas in a Western country, hidden for privacy, you can see the relief, the admiration. Suddenly they want to know about your life, what you did there, how long you were there. They are like, suddenly like, oh, you're not like the others. You're different. Thank God you're not like those others. It's almost a sense of, if you have a Western expertise, I can relax around you, which then taps into that conversation we started with earlier about African expertise being undervalued. The other suspicion was when people assume that Africans in a workplace, particularly performing at management or leadership levels, are there because they're a token or a diversity hire. It's never because they worked hard or they have merit or whatever. It's because they are there because the company needed to increase their, you know, their diversity quota, you know. So not having their qualifications respected, the assumption is that employment is an undeserved favor and not a job that has been earned through merit. And you can read there on the screen what one very senior social worker told me about what they were told in their workplace. You know, people often saying, oh, you're very lucky to be here, you know, even though they have very high expertise. The other, you know, a doctor spoke to me about the way in which he experienced this racial suspicion from his from his patients. And he would say when he moved to Australia, he moved into a regional town, and he would say patients would point blank just say, I don't want to be treated by you. And it took him about 18 months before, you know, patients could actively not look so distorted and destroyed when they were actually put on his roster. And so he said that was very difficult for him to adjust. Another person told me about when they go to work, how they have to show their badge, you know, because they are a nurse. And she said, when I report to work, I introduce myself and I say, I'm so-and-so and I'm working in this ward this afternoon. And they already know that because they know there's a registered nurse coming in the system, but you will still find them questioning me, which I don't see happening with Caucasian nurses, but they will question me 2 or 3 times. And even make sure that I'm a registered nurse, they will check my badge to see if my initials read registered nurse. So I still feel like they don't believe me. So this person talks about these Africans being viewed from a place of deficit all the time. The final concept, and I hope I'm doing okay for time, I want to talk about is what we call the racial burden of proof. Literally every person I spoke to in this study said that they work 150%. You know, they can't do 100% and be considered that they are doing a good job, you know. So it's one participant described it as always being guilty until you're proven innocent kind of a situation. So for Africans, the default is that you're less capable and incompetent. So to prove yourself beyond that stereotype, you need to put in more work than your white colleagues. You need to work weekends, you need to work long hours. So you can see that same doctor who told me that black people didn't want to see a black doctor, said that it took about 12 to 18 months to really prove that he had the skills, if not better or equivalent to other white doctors working alongside him. And they say they always look at what you do over your shoulder to make sure that you do the right thing. Until you prove yourself, they do not get off your back, you know? So micromanagement. another senior accountant told me that the concept of being an accountant while Black is because of those criminalized stereotypes, is looking after people's money when they don't trust that you know what you're doing. And he said, when you're Black and you're a professional, you have to prove yourself. But any person has to prove themselves, even white people have to prove themselves at work. But I think the biggest difference with Africans or Black person like myself, you always have to keep proving yourself, and sometimes it's never enough. Okay, so you're starting to get the gist of the burden, the exhaustion that I was talking about before, because you have to constantly do more, not just to do your work, but really to dispel the myths and the stereotypes that you're working with. So what's the summary of the work that we are talking about today? So today, the summary of my conversation has to give you a snap overview of what very highly skilled African professionals told me about their experiences at work. And the other thing actually about the burden of proof is that it creates this concept of the double concept of visibility and invisibility. So visibility in that you're hyper visible, you're the Black person in the organization, and invisibility in that you're always passed over for promotions or opportunities when they do come, because in some organizations, those are reserved not for Black people, people of color, which then affects their career. So this is the summary that I gathered from this research and from the research of other people, is that most workplaces are actually sites of racial contestation. You know, people have been so traumatized by the racial experiences in the workplace, and often it's those little things, it's never the big things, it's the compounding effects of people always questioning you, people always doing these things that create such a, what we call racial trauma in the workplace. What we also found is that racial and cultural safety lacks in most organizations, and that's a conversation for another day. And also what I heard is that Black people who actually speak about these experiences are gaslighted. They're excluded by their colleagues. They're told not to make everything about race. They're told that it's better here than, quote unquote, the shithole country they came from. Like, there's real gaslighting violence sometimes happening in some of these conversations when they report. So what they do is that they're silenced outside, and they also silence themselves, which I think is worse. So most workplaces are not race-free. And what we found is microaggressions are the most common forms of racism in the workplace. And organizations often undervalue Black expertise, which I think is sad, because just the level at which, you know, these people work is quite, like you can hear a lot of people put in 150%. And finally, what's the way forward for us? I know we can't really solve these big wicked problems with a 20 minutes talk, but, you know, for those of you who are in an organizational context, you know, have you thought about, you know, adopting concepts of cultural humility and cultural safety? What I'm suggesting here is that frameworks of cultural competency have never worked, and they won't work. It's not possible to be competent in someone else's culture. What we can approach those conversations is from a place of humility, so we can foster a culture of safety in our workplaces. To start having conversations about these impacts in the workplace. And also most, you know, practical thing, pay Black people the equivalent of their expertise and promote them. A lot of people that I spoke to were being paid less than what their white colleagues were paid, even junior colleagues were not being promoted. So celebrate your Black colleagues, don't tolerate, you know, so that they can feel that they deserve to be there. And of course, the concept of training your staff on the impacts of microaggressions, and the fact that racial trauma, just like any other trauma, impacts people's well-being, sense of safety, sense of worth, and sense of dignity. So I thought I would stop there for today because there's a lot, but I invite you to think about your experiences either as an African professional or as a colleague who works alongside Africans in your workplace. Do you experience what we call the burden of blackness at the workplace, or do you feel like a perpetual stranger in your workplace despite the effort that you've put in to fit in? So, you know, this is just a conversation to open up more conversations for us in the future. So I hope you enjoyed reading about these stories, and thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Kathomi. That was really a wonderful presentation and lots to think about. And beautifully timed as well. I didn't have to pop in and give you a 5-minute warning. Thank you. We already have a couple of questions in the Q&A, and don't forget, everyone, if you'd like to ask a question, please put it in the Q&A box. So I'll leave my own questions for the moment and move on to these. Oh, one should be very easy. What does RBF in the last slide stand for?
Oh, sorry, it's racial battle fatigue. It's a concept called racial battle fatigue, which is the fatigue.
Oh, something's happened to your sound, Kathomi. I know you warned me that might happen, and it just.
How is that now?
That's much better.
RBF is racial battle fatigue, and it was coined by a guy called William Smith to talk about the fatigue of existing in a space where you constantly have to deal with racial stresses, to have no racial cushion, and to be navigating and thinking about all these things every day creates racial fatigue.
Thank you. And then the next question from Lanri is, what role do the social equity community do to influence government and organisations why we need to focus more on inclusion rather than diversity? So I guess making that point that there's,
yeah.
I think this came up in the chat, I think, as well, about people having their diversity higher, but that doesn't mean that those people were included.
Yeah, and I think this is why it's very important for us to have these conversations about having Black people in your organizations and hiring Black people, people of color, doesn't mean that that environment is safe for them. Right, we really need to start creating and working from a place of safety, not just, you know, hiring people so that you can use them to say, look, we are so diverse, we hire Africans, or we hire women, or we hire people with disabilities. And Lanri, I even want to move, you know, further from the concept of inclusion and talk about belonging. It is possible to be included in a party, for example, to be invited to a party and to be included. And it's possible for you to get to that party and feel utterly and completely like you do not belong. So, you know, the first, of course, is that, you know, inclusion, but the outcome really to be a sense of belonging, that it is possible for me to work here and feel like I have a right and a dignified sense that I belong here. So many organizations can start pushing these conversations, and let's start moving away from the concept of diversification to the concept of belonging, for everybody to have a sense of belonging. That's my view.
Thank you. I think that's a really, really nice distinction. Okay, another question here from Akuch. It seems that Australians only welcome Black professionals and treat them as equals when they're making them look good on a global context. For example, Peter Boll being very celebrated and called Australian only because he was bringing medals home at the Olympics. So, Kathomi, how do we shift Australians' thinking on micro levels of workplaces, not only at macro Olympics level, to accept African professionals as capable and competent in their field? Did your participants suggest any ways such experiences and thinking can be challenged while keeping them safe in their workplaces?
Oh, that is such a good question, Coach, because most of my participants, because of course I was interviewing people who are very highly skilled in leadership positions, saying, I have to be excellent. There is no room for me to be good at my job. I need to be great at my job. you know, whereas with my white colleagues, they can be good, you know, but I can never be good because I need to be excellent and I need to be exemplary in my work to prove that I am not that incompetent, you know, stereotype thing. And I think you're right in that we like to celebrate people who, what we call the model minority, and what I also like to call the model Black person, the one who is not like all the others, you know, and that's the one we like to embrace. But when it comes to supporting all the other young people who are struggling and who are suffering from racial trauma or mental health issues due to the issues we've talked about, we don't like those very much because they're a lot of work. You know, we like the ones who are modeling the fact that we can continue to say that we are a very inclusive society and we welcome everybody. So yeah, that is something that came up a lot. Do I have an immediate answer? No, I think the answer really comes back to the concept of, can we start focusing more on conversations about what does it mean to belong? What does it mean for people to have a home here? And a home is where you feel safe, where you feel loved, where you feel accepted. It's not just a place where you come to earn money, you know, and to make a career. It's a place where essentially you feel deeply, you have a felt sense of love and connection and belonging. So, you know, yeah, what happens to other people who are not acing it in their work professionals and are really needing our support? And I think that conversations opens a dialogue for that.
Thank you. Yeah. So, oh, hang on, I think we might have another question. Yeah, a couple more questions here. Thank you for sharing today, Kathomi. My employer wants to create and work from a place of safety and belonging, but it's not coming from top down. It comes from individuals of colour who know how to do this. Where do you see this work being done well, if anywhere?
Can you repeat that? I think I missed. Oh, yeah. My employer wants to. Well, maybe, Joanne, that is a conversation you can actually, you know, talk to me about outside of this, because there are very many people who are working to train organizations through the models of cultural safety and cultural humility rather than cultural competency, which is what a lot of organizations drift to. Or, you know, a colleague was racist, let's send them to a 2-hour workshop on cultural competency. No, that's not going to do it. But I think sometimes it's often used as a gateway and as an escape. So if your organizations are really interested to do organizational shifts around creating cultural safety and racial safety, you can always get in touch with me and I can put you in contact with people who are doing this work in different places if you want to engage that way.
Thank you. And one last one from Lanre. I'm really not sure whether you have to be excellent. Being excellent allows people to accept you, because I think it makes them exclude you because they feel threatened. And the Australian word tall poppy syndrome kicks in. What are your thoughts on that?
I cannot agree more with Lanre, because that's what we call the double jeopardy of there's no place to rest your head. You can't be good, but you also can't be excellent. You're constantly having to be walking the thin line to not upset white comfort. And white comfort can be upset by having a Black colleague who is actually doing much, much better than you, particularly when you personally believe that it's not the place of that Black person to occupy that space. So I couldn't go through everything today from my research because of time, but if anybody is really interested in continuing the conversation of the fascinating stories that I heard from people and just blows your mind about the way people experience these things, I'm very open for conversations. Or you can open up other dialogues where you can invite me to come and speak to you more about this.
Thank you. Now I'm going to use my position to just ask one question of my own, if that's okay, because I think we're, oh, hang on, there might be one more in the chat as well. Oh no, that's okay. Yes, I just wanted to ask, on your last slide, you pointed out the difference between cultural humility and cultural competence. And I'm just wondering if you could say a tiny bit more about that difference. I really like the idea of cultural humility, and I'd like to just
sure. Personally, I've stopped teaching my students about ideas of cultural competency, because I think what cultural competency does is the goal is to teach you how to be an expert. Now, when it comes to people experiences, I can never ever be an expert of your life experiences, especially a life that I do not share, and the lens through which your body allows you to experience things that I do not know. So, so cultural competency is really about teaching expertise, whereas humility is about teaching people how to kind of be a student of other people's experiences. So one is very focused on experts, and the other one is focusing on tell me more about what you need to experience a sense of belonging here. Teach me and allow me to be a student of your life experience. And competency, I'm not even competent in my own culture, Karen. I don't know how anybody can be competent in mine, because culture is so complex. So I assume that when we engage from a place of humility, knowing there is so much we don't know, but we are still willing to learn, willing to be students of other people's experiences, coming to that conversation without a defensiveness, and embracing other experiences, I think would be much better than this, than cultural competency. The other thing that I find with cultural competency is then when people do one workshop, they're like, oh, now I can go and work with all those Africans, I know what to ask, I know what to do, I know what to ask. But what cultural competency does, it teaches you the right questions to ask. What cultural humility does, it teaches you the right kind of, not that you're not focusing on the question, you're focusing on the experience, not asking the right questions, but on the experience. Yeah. Hope that answers.
Thank you. I think that was beautifully explained. Thank you so much. Okay, we are out of time. I could listen to you speak about this all day, as I'm sure many others could. There's been you probably haven't been able to keep up with all the comments in the chat, but lots of appreciation for everything you've been saying. So yes, I'd just like to thank you and thank everyone for coming along and being so engaged in the chat and in the questions as well. And please do, if you're not already, please do make sure you're on the email list for the Melbourne Social Equity Institute and or the Peter McMullen Centre on Statelessness, so that you hear about any future events that we're holding. And with that, I'll just say thank you again, and we'll leave it there.
Yeah, the final thing that I wanted to say is that one of the participants has pointed out that I'm also a therapist. So some of the experiences here that we're talking about, I hear them every day in my therapy practice. So if you're a person who's been triggered or activated or whatever by the conversations today, so I really, really encourage you to seek the support of a counsellor who is culturally safe to support you with that experience as well.
Thank you. Those sound like wise last words. Okay, we'll finish up there.